after almost 7 years, the PS4's lineup of exclusives is coming to an end. Finishing this journey of games is Ghost of Tsushima, developed by Sucker Punch Productions, the creators of the infamous games. I'll admit that while I was looking forward to this game, I was never blown away by any of the gameplay demos shown to us. The footage that always got me hooked was the cinematic trailers. The game's various environments looked beautiful, and the music sounded incredible. Many people compared the style of the open world and gameplay of this to that of the Assassin's Creed franchise. Over time, I began to feel the same way, and while I'm someone who actually quite enjoyed the newest installments of the Assassin's Creed games, I was worried that this would be a Japanese reskin of those titles. After finishing Ghost of Tsushima, I am very happy to say that not only is this very different from those games, but it's far superior. I went in expecting a fun but average open world title, and came out having experienced a far better game than I imagined.
Kosenkan!
When we take their life, we look them in the eye with courage and respect.
The game is set in the year 1274, on the Japanese island of Tsushima. The Mongols, led by Khotan Khan, have conquered the island, and after losing a battle where over 80 samurai are killed, Jin Sakai, one of the last remaining samurais on the island, fights for his home, leaving behind the samurai code and taking on an honorless approach of killing enemies through whatever means necessary.
Honor died on the beach.
Over the course of the game, you will attempt to build a resistance against the invaders to take back your land. The story of Ghost of Tsushima is simple and fairly straightforward besides a few surprising and very well executed twists along the way. What strengthened the game's narrative, however, was playing the game's side missions known as Tales. A handful of these missions are dedicated to telling personal stories of the game's side characters who you recruit in the main campaign, discovering their backstories and fleshing out their characters, greatly strengthening the battle sections of the main campaign, where you fight with them side by side. Knowing who was by your side really enhanced the experience, and it felt like you were truly fighting alongside many allies. If you're going to play this game, I urge you to play the side missions with these characters as you play the game's main story. As I mentioned earlier, you play as Jin Sakai, nephew of Lord Shimura, the lead samurai on the island. Jin is at times a very stoic and quiet character, but it fits the type of man he is, as samurai are supposed to hide their emotions. Over the course of the game, however, he will break the code due to your in-game actions, and seeing the way he reacts to what he must do made me care for his personal journey. Overall, I really like the game's narrative. It isn't anything particularly original, but where it won me over was with its execution. Speaking of executions, we have the game's combat. This was the aspect of the game that I was personally the most worried about going in. It looked choppy, repetitive, and far too easy, mowing down enemies one by one without taking any real damage. Having played the game, all of those worries I just mentioned are completely wrong. The gameplay is addicting as hell. I never once got tired of it, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were a few times where I thought I had mastered the combat, only for the game to bring in enemies with faster, deadlier attacks, as well as more heavily armored. Certain enemy types who came across as mini-bosses early on in the campaign would eventually become common threats. This is one area that this game greatly differs from the Assassin's Creed franchise. Enemies felt like they became stronger as the game went on, improving their attacks, just like yourself, whereas the Assassin's Creed games tend to just throw more health at your later foes. In combat, the square button is used as a lighter, quicker attack, while the triangle button is reserved for heavy attacks that break enemy blocks. As you progress throughout the story, you gain more combat stances through either studying or killing enemy leaders. Different stances are effective for different enemy types. Use the stone stance for sword enemies, water stance for shields, wind stance for spears, and moon stance for brutes. You quickly change these stances by holding down the right trigger and clicking one of the 4 PlayStation shapes. Similar to many other games, basic attacks can be blocked by holding down the left bumper, more commonly known as L1. There are certain unblockable attacks, however, signified by a red flash, which require you to either dodge or roll away in order to avoid, while blue attacks can be parried but only by pressing block at the last second. If you continue to hold down the block button, these attacks will get through and deal damage. Where this can get challenging is when you have loads of enemies attacking you at once, all with different weapons as well as mixing up light and heavy attacks. As you kill enemies, you refill your resolve gauge. Resolve can be used to either heal yourself by pressing down on the D-pad, or to use special attacks, which may use one or more resolve. Besides your blade, you can also use a bow. In the game, there are two different types: the half bow, given to you by playing the main campaign, and the longbow, given in a side quest. At first, the bow felt a bit sluggish to me. Compared to other games, I found its movement while aiming to be a bit slower, but after some time using it, I adjusted. Each bow also has special types of arrows. The half bow can shoot flaming arrows, while the longbow can fire explosive ones. The game also offers a far more stealthier approach, more often called the Way of the Ghost. Stealth gameplay is fairly simple. Sneak up behind enemies and stab them in the throat with a blade. Where approaches can vary is with the Ghost's many weapons. You can throw kunai blades to stagger and damage enemies, black powder bombs which have the same effect but cause more staggering, smoke bombs to use as a quick escape or to stun enemies in combat, sticky bombs to blow up foes, wind chimes and firecrackers to distract enemies, and darts which can be used to poison enemies or to turn them on each other. I really loved the variety of tools at my disposal, and implementing them with different scenarios was always a lot of fun. I've heard some people complain about the AI being completely clueless if you get caught when in stealth, but I never found it to be a problem for myself. I have seen evidence of its existence, however, so I thought it was worth mentioning. The last thing I want to touch on for gameplay is traversal. Like most other open world games, you are joined by a horse companion which will stay with you for your journey. Horses are something that can feel very different depending on the game. They either work or they don't. For example, in The Witcher 3, I found the horse to be a bit of an annoyance at times. In Red Dead, I would constantly button mash while riding the horse to get to a location, something that I found to be incredibly repetitive. Here, the horse feels great. I never had any real issues with it. Sometimes it would occasionally get stuck on objects, but these scenarios were few and far between. Besides your horse, traversal includes climbing and rope swinging. Now, my go-to comparison when it comes to both of these is Uncharted 4. I really don't think any game has ever come close to matching the feeling of climbing in Uncharted. Climbing in Ghost was fine. You move the thumbstick and push down or up in the direction you want to go. You don't use it too often like you do in Uncharted, so the lack of detail with it never bothered me. If I had to compare how it felt to another game, I'd say it was pretty similar to the 2018 God of War. Rope swinging, on the other hand, is a ton of fun. It doesn't come up a whole bunch, but there were some sections of the game where swinging across an area with it was incredibly satisfying.
Swing myself across.
All in all, the gameplay in Ghost really surprised me. As someone who found the combat to look pretty generic going in, I'm very happy to say that it's some of the most fun I've had with combat since God of War. Oh, and those standoffs were always badass to do. The map of Ghost of Tsushima is quite large. Going in, I thought the environments looked great, which they certainly do, but I thought the map felt a little dead. It just looked really generic and very similar to many Ubisoft open world games. Playing the game, I actually found myself really falling in love with the map. A lot of the game's different towns felt like reskins of each other with a few exceptions, but the diversity of environments surrounding the towns and villages you visit masked those similarities. At the villages you come across, you can upgrade all kinds of equipment, whether it's adding damage to your sword, upgrading your armor and coloring it differently with dye from flowers found throughout the map, upgrading your bow, or the amount of throwables you can carry. All of these upgrades are made possible through collecting resources found at enemy camps or lying around in the wild. As for different events in the game's map, there are quite a few things to do. Sometimes you may come across a bird which will lead you to a nearby location. There's also foxes which, if followed, will lead you to a shrine. Honoring these shrines will allow for you to unlock more charm slots, which can be filled with various charms given to you when completing missions or when taking back camps from the Mongols. These can grant different perks and abilities to strengthen your gameplay style, and can be changed at any point, same with the game's various sets of armor. You can also discover Bamboo Strikes, which is a fun button response minigame that upgrades the amount of resolve slots you have. When venturing throughout the world, you may also come across hot springs, where Jin strips down butt naked to reflect on aspects of his life, before granting you more health. You can even discover haiku poem spots where you can sit down and make a short haiku, creating a headband for you to wear with whatever you wrote.
Giving life to all. The outstretched hands left to fend. Visions always clear.
Like a lot of open world games, there's a lot of basic enemy camp scenarios you come across, where you may have to free hostages
Hold still.
or kill a bunch of enemies. These are extremely basic in design and can get pretty repetitive as far as a side event goes, but as I said, most games have them. Once you've cleared out a camp, however, you may discover people who need help, thus creating a side mission. Some of these are also pretty basic. Find enemies who stole their food, and slaughter them like livestock. As I mentioned earlier, however, some of these tales that are based on developing characters in the main story are great. Most of these characters are very well written and all have compelling stories. I especially liked Lady Masako, who is seeking revenge on whoever it was who slaughtered her family, and Sensei Ishikawa, who is searching for his previous student gone bad in a very Luke Skywalker Kylo Ren feeling storyline. There's also musicians you come across who tell stories called mythic tales, which will lead you on a quest to unlock things like flaming swords, a longbow, ancient armor, and many more. And there's still many more things to do, like finding crickets, which can help you learn songs to play on your flute, which will then change the weather. If I continue to list events that you can do in this game, it's going to start sounding like a grocery list, but you get my point. There's a lot to do here. Ghost of Tsushima is a beautiful game. If there's one aspect of the presentation I have to compliment the most, it's the particles. While traveling through the various exotic locations, you will see all kinds of leaves and bugs blowing and flying around in the wind. This, as well as the lighting, is where the game visually shines the most. Actual graphics are pretty good for the most part. Textures are not as refined as, say, Red Dead Redemption 2. Many of the time, things like rocks and dirt can look pretty bland without a whole lot of detail, and at times, low textures. But that's only if you stop to stare at the floor, which in a game like this, you're probably not going to be doing anyways. One of the aspects I really loved about this game's visual presentation was with its take on the in-game HUD. Some games' HUDs nowadays can feel really cluttered with all these things they throw at you. Ghost keeps these things to a bare minimum. If you're free roaming in the open world, that's all you're going to see. You don't have an obnoxious minimap or waypoint line at the top of the screen. When fighting, you have your health and the amount of tools you have, which are kept just large enough for you to see. I really liked all of this as it lets you focus on the game's visual beauty. Taking the place of the minimap and waypoint bar is gusts of wind, which guides you in the direction of your set objective. Simply open the map, select where you want to head, and then
Ride like the wind, Bullseye!
if you eventually find yourself getting lost or lose track of where you're headed, simply swipe up on the touchpad and a larger, more obvious gust of wind will show you the way. Speaking of traveling to different areas, I want to give Sucker Punch huge props for including the fastest loading screens I have seen in a game. Seriously, look how fast it took me to go from one end of the map to the other. Even loading up a save file took 10 seconds or less on my PS4 Pro, it's that good. Now where I do have my problems with the game's presentation is with its cutscenes and NPC interactions. Ghost of Tsushima features the old, outdated, fade to black every single time you talk to someone scenario, and I just can't help but feel a little bit frustrated with this, as it's something we see less and less in games nowadays, so to see it in cutscenes and when just talking to random NPCs, it's pretty noticeable. Same can be said about the awkward camera angles when talking to NPCs. The camera tends to just cut to shots from 20 feet
25.
away from the characters, and it just looks unnatural and boring. The game does feature some pretty cool modes, however. You can use Kurosawa mode, named after the famous Japanese samurai film director, which sets the game to black and white, adds a lot of realistic film grain, and adds a Japanese voice track, which can also be used when playing the game in color. I'll be honest, I opted out of the Japanese voice track because of the fact that it's not lip-synced. It just makes the conversations really awkward to watch and definitely pulls me out of the immersion.
堺の家を守ることです。
それは父の言葉であろう。
I also found at times the camera during combat was annoying and would block me from properly viewing what I needed to. All in all, it's a great looking game, with amazing environments, but there are some hiccups with the camera and the way conversations and cutscenes are handled. The last category I want to touch on before I give my final thoughts is the score. Ghost of Tsushima features a magnificent soundtrack. From the trailer, I knew this was going to be a score I would dig, and I certainly did. Hearing the quieter, peaceful themes played on the flute while exploring grasslands, or booming drums and other instruments going at it while slicing enemies into pieces during combat, always helped bring me right into the game. Overall, Ghost of Tsushima is a brilliant game, and a massive increase in quality from previous Sucker Punch titles. It features a well-told, emotionally investing story, great memorable side characters, a charming and stunning open world filled with various environments, one of the best in-game progression systems I've seen, and a brutal and satisfying combat system that I never grew tired of. It's the samurai game I've always wanted, and while there were a few minor hiccups with its presentation, it's nonetheless a fantastic game, and one hell of a way to send off the PlayStation 4.